And last night, I tell you, to watch that thing on television as I did,
Yeah.
to see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes.
In 1789, the socioeconomic climate in France was at its boiling point. While the wealthy enjoyed great luxury and opulence, the poor couldn't even guarantee food on the table. Finally, the people of France had had enough and rose up to overthrow their government in one of the most famous and influential revolutions in history. King Louis XVI and his wife, Marie Antoinette, would be guillotined along with 17,000 other nobles and members of the upper classes. The disenfranchised proletariat had succeeded in toppling the country's elite, who had owned a vastly disproportionate percentage of the nation's wealth. In fact, the top 20% of earners in pre-revolution France held 60% of the wealth, whereas the bottom 40% held only 14%. Outrageous, right? Of course, inequality to this extent would not be tolerated in the modern era. Except it is. The bottom 40% of Americans actually hold a smaller percentage of wealth than their French counterparts. Yes, that's right. In the richest country on earth, the supposed beacon of hope for the world, the American working class is being exploited to a greater extent than the workers of an 18th century monarchy. How did this happen? How does such a vast disparity in wealth get swept under the rug? Well, exactly how any other country attempts to mold the thoughts and opinions of a people. Propaganda. Yes, even the United States, land of the free, home of the brave, is guilty of purposely manipulating its own citizens. And the American dream is one of the most successful pieces of propaganda ever created. The idea that no matter your race, gender, sexuality, or origin, that you can make it in America is an incredibly dangerous idea. It shifts all the blame of the issue of poverty on the impoverished and not on the system that perpetuates it. It aids racist thought among the masses, who see the struggle of minorities as a reflection of their race rather than the effect of an oppressive system. The faux glorification of hard work has allowed millions of workers to be willfully exploited by corporate entities. This American dream we speak of is one of capitalism's greatest tools in keeping the rich rich and the poor poor. Only, it didn't start out this way. The earliest instances of the use of the term the American dream come from the turn of the century, when it stood for opportunity, liberty, and equality. In the late 1890s and early 1900s, the first American multimillionaires were monopolizing the steel and oil industries. This mass amalgamation of wealth alarmed many across the country, who saw how the further enrichment of the ultra-wealthy could have incredibly negative effects on the nation. They saw how an oligarchical system could manifest itself through the elite's influence in politics. They called this the un-American dream, because back then, that phrase wasn't about rugged individualism. It was about communal prosperity and looking out for your fellow American. This is evident in James Truslow Adams's The Epic of America. Published in 1931, Adams's book advocated for the original American dream and denounced the nation's relatively recent obsession with material wealth. The shift in definition of the American dream began as the Cold War started to heat up. With proxy wars in Vietnam and Korea, the U.S. government was determined to keep the American public terrified of communism. Thus, the Red Scare began, and anti-communist propaganda started to seep into every form of media. And in this frenzy, the American dream was manipulated into a piece of capitalist propaganda. Visions of cookie-cutter suburban neighborhoods, white picket fences, new cars, and the nuclear family graced every newsstand and television screen in the nation. Consumerism devoured the country as materialist practices were glamorized in media. McCarthyism raged as millions were accused of being communist all across the country. The effects of this fear instilled by McCarthyism and other forms of Red Scare propaganda can still be felt today, as many commonplace policies, such as universal health care or any kind of policy that aids the poor, is immediately labeled as socialist by both conservatives and liberals alike. While the Red Scare was very successful in shaping the general public's opinion on leftist policy, there were still many Americans who were not fooled. Particularly young people in the black community saw right through these lies. They knew that the U.S. government was sacrificing the lives of young men in order to protect a greed-filled ideology, and they weren't afraid to voice their distaste. The hippie and black power movement in the 60s and 70s were seen as a real threat in the eyes of the federal government. But what could be done to quell these movements? The war on drugs is another one of the most destructive practices in American history. Portrayed to the average American as a way to curb illegal drug use, its true purpose was much more sinister. Former Nixon cabinet member John Ehrlichman was quoted in saying, "You want to know what this was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." The drug war would continue through the Reagan administration and only get worse. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. This bill established mandatory minimum sentences for specific amounts of cocaine possession. However, under closer inspection, the bill disproportionately affected black communities. For instance, distribution of 5 grams of crack cocaine carried a 5-year minimum sentence, whereas 500 grams of powder cocaine carried that same 5-year sentence. So what's the difference between the two substances? Practically nothing, except for the fact that powder cocaine was associated with whites and crack was associated with blacks. By taking more black people into prison, the U.S. government was intentionally ripping apart low-income black homes and accelerating the cycle of poverty that continues to the present day. The year is 2022. The future is here. Cars drive themselves, artificial organs are successful, drones deliver mail, the Browns are actually relevant, pigs have flown, you get it. The racial wealth gap in America is as wide now as it was in 1968, but racism isn't a problem anymore. 59% of Americans are one hospital visit away from bankruptcy, but we can't afford universal health care because that's just too socialist. While the U.S. makes up less than 5% of the world's population, America has over 20% of the world's prisoners. But we can't have real prison reform because law and order. The United States has some real issues, many of which I don't even have the time to get into. But unfortunately, instead of working to fix these problems, we're too busy arguing over whether they really exist. We have reached a point of near stagnation in progress. The very organizations and leaders we have put our trust into have failed us. It is time to organize. If we are ever to make an American dream that is equally attainable for everyone, radical change must occur. We can no longer wait around for corrupt, money-hungry politicians to truly represent the voice of the people. The people must unite against the elites and in one breath proclaim that we will not go gentle into that good night. Our work will no longer be the victim of exploitation. Our planet will no longer be drained and abused for profit. Our children of color will no longer know the pain of silent subjugation. Our brothers and sisters in the Middle East will no longer cower at the sight of our flag. Our needs will no longer be secondary to corporate interest. But until that day, until we the people unite as one against the ruling class, our American dream will be just that, a dream.